in. All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is Tim McDonald coming to you with another episode of Advocacy at Work. And today I have a very special guest and probably one of the people responsible for starting my advocacy journey, Angie Davis. How you doing, Angie?
Doing great. Doing great. Glad to be here.
I'm so happy you're here with us, and I can't wait to dive in. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and Fight CRC to begin with, just so people have an idea of who I'm talking to here.
No, that sounds great. I'm Angie Davis. I'm the CEO of Fight Colorectal Cancer. We're a national advocacy organization focused on empowering patients to share their stories, to educate them on their treatment options and access to screening as well. And then we really do focus a lot on advocacy and the way we define it as really a policy change advocacy effort. So we do that in a couple ways. You see, Tim's background with our flag installation in Washington, D.C., but we also train advocates to be research advocates to inform research efforts around the country.
Well, that's great. And I think you just kind of jumped into my first question, which was how would you define advocacy? I know you have a couple, just because of my personal involvement with Fight CRC, a couple different ways that you probably would kind of group those advocates, or is there something you want to add for what you already said about advocacy?
Well, I think people define advocacy differently. I think it can be on a spectrum for sure. If you want to share your story as a survivor and encourage people to be screened or encourage people to seek information about their treatment, I think that's a form of advocacy. I think as you evolve and telling your story, sometimes there's a group of folks who are like, okay, I want to make change. I want to use my story to do something. And it can lead them to policy change and really engaging their members of Congress, talking to their local, leaders. And I think that's a really important part of advocacy. And then for the group of folks that are really interested in the science, really interested in advancing the science, there's a form of advocacy called research advocacy, where you can engage researchers and scientists and help guide and inform clinical trials and grants, both locally and nationally.
Okay. I'm back, I think.
Yeah, you're back.
My computer does this. It's never happened during a podcast, so we'll just, I'm not sure how much it recorded, but right when you started answering advocacy, I kind of froze up. But let me just close, before we go too much further, let me just close up a couple things and see if that might help with my computer. Why is this not giving me the option to close these? I think just between some of I got different browsers open or different, windows open for each thing that I do, between what I'm helping Town with, what I'm doing with the podcast, what I do with Man Up to Cancer. It's all like all over the place. So come on. There we go. Shut that one down. And then let me just do one other one and close a couple tabs here. Probably one of the reasons why it does this, but my laptop's also like 4 years old, so I'm like, let me just close out a couple tabs here just to make sure that we're not getting anything. Don't need this right now. Don't need that. Okay, I think we should be okay now.
Awesome.
So what I will do is I'll just give a short second, and then you can just jump in, because I know what came across and recorded was when I asked you, would you like to add anything about advocacy? And then you could just start from there.
Okay,
So,
I'll do that.
okay.
So as it relates to advocacy, I think there's sort of a spectrum of engagement, and you can raise awareness by telling your story as a survivor. And I think that's always the first step. And then as you tell your story and as you sort of become more comfortable, I think there's a certain group of folks that are like, okay, I really want to take action. I want my story to be meaningful, but I want it to drive something. And so I think there's this policy change advocate group that becomes an activist, and they go to Washington, D.C. They go to their sort of local government officials or local community leaders, and they start pushing for change. And I think that's so important. And then there's a third group of folks that I feel like are really interested in the science, and we call them our research advocates, but those are the ones that really want to get to know the researchers, figure out how to review grants, how to advance the patient voice as it relates to research. So that can be done nationally, that can be done locally, but I think there are super advocates that are really excited about the science. So I think there are several ways you can define advocacy, but for our organization, we really want to empower people to move through the awareness into taking action.
I love that. I actually just posted something on LinkedIn from an article I wrote about 11 years ago that was about a homeless man that I met on the streets when I was working in New York City. And the quote that I think I shared on LinkedIn was, "It's not what we do, it's the matter that we share what we do that makes bigger impact."
Exactly. I mean, you really have embodied all of our advocacy efforts for sure.
Well, you know, and I always bring up the fact, because just so people know that, you know, you kind of, when I mentioned that you got me started in this, is right after I was diagnosed with colorectal cancer, I had applied to be an ambassador with Fight CRC and didn't even know what an advocate was at the time, and jumped in and got to be aware of it. So, and now I'm a research advocacy person with Fight CRC. So it's like, you know, I've kind of done a little bit of everything that you've just gone through already. So
you're like the model advocate, right? Like you started with sharing your story, and then started to push for legislation, and then really got into the science. And I think that's awesome. And I think you're, like what you said, like you don't know what you're going to be passionate about. So being able to introduce yourself to different ways of engagement is awesome.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how these advocates that Fight CRC, you know, utilizes, how do they help the mission that you have?
You know, now more than ever, it's so important that we have a unified voice as a community. And I think colorectal cancer is the second leading cause of cancer deaths in the country. And with so many competing priorities in the, you know, when we start, you know, you turn on the news and you can see, like, on whatever news channel you watch, like there's all these competing priorities, but cancer still happens. People are still being diagnosed. And so what I think cancer patients do, especially in colorectal cancer, is just that constant drumbeat of saying, this is really important. I'm a real person being impacted by this. And budget cuts, the numbers that, you know, you're throwing around in Washington, D.C., that's me. That's impacting me. And I think that's now really the most important thing we can do. It may not change legislation. It may not change the budget this year, but I think this is a long game. And I always say, like, advocates have to like see this as a marathon and not a sprint, because it's about showing up every day and showing up day after day for our policymakers to take us seriously.
Use one of the stories that I learned early on from another colorectal cancer person, the first one I met who had similar condition to me. And that was the advice he gave me. Look at this as a marathon that you weren't prepared to run. And just when you think you're done, you'll be asked to run another one.
100%.
So it sounds like going through colorectal cancer is very similar to
like a training ground.
An advocate. So tell me a little bit about you know, was advocates part of Fight CRC from the very beginning? I know you haven't been there from the very beginning, but you've been there long enough, and I know you know the history. But
Yeah.
you know, were they part of it from the very beginning, or how did it kind of come about?
Actually, it was started by advocates. So Nancy Roach, our founder, her mother-in-law was diagnosed with colorectal cancer, and Nancy, is just an activist by nature. And so when she looked at the sort of the community at the time, she was like, there's really this missing voice of like, the activists, like people being able to come together around a unified, vision of like eradicating colorectal cancer. And so she started Fight Colorectal Cancer really with that in mind, like being an advocacy organization and then informing research. And so those were the two areas that she was really passionate about. When I came on board, we were a small group of 4, and I was asked to really build a program. I was, director of community outreach is when I started. When I started on staff, but I had been an advocate prior. I'd attended Call on Congress, and they asked me like, why don't we have more people engaged? And honestly, like, I think we skipped that first step of encouraging and empowering people to tell their stories. And we were so deep in the like policy side that it was really intimidating. So when I came on board, my job was to make it less intimidating and encourage people to tell their stories and get ready for that long marathon of, advocacy.
That's great. So, I know you described how it changed a little bit, but how has it really like evolved since you've been involved, with the organization? How have you seen the advocacy programs that Fight CRC has evolve in your time there?
I might take it even a step further, like how's colorectal cancer changed? I've been in colorectal cancer for 20 years. And when I was working in South Carolina on a colorectal cancer screening program, we had a support group. And for those who were diagnosed with colorectal cancer, and we couldn't get anyone to show up. I mean, it was like maybe 2 or 3 people would show up. And I would ask people like, our breast cancer support groups, our prostate cancer, all these support groups are so well attended. And when we asked the nurses, they would say, oh, our patients are really embarrassed. Like they just don't, feel super comfortable talking about their symptoms, talking about, what happened. And, when I started at Fight Colorectal Cancer, that was sort of the temperature, within the community. It was still like, I don't want to tell anybody I have colorectal cancer, so I just say I have cancer. And I think that's changed a lot. We started a campaign called 1 Million Strong when I first started, and it was sort of launching the Strong Arm Selfie. But the point of it was to change the face of this disease. It was saying that everyone is so strong. There's so much hope. They're all very resilient, and they're really beautiful people. And so we really wanted to humanize everyone's story, but also give them a story that they weren't bashful about or embarrassed about. And we got to say poop, we got to say fart, we got to say all these things. And so I feel like it was a great icebreaker. And over the last 20 years, I've seen that change. I think it's like people like you change things, like could be your neighbor, it could be your brother, it could be everyone. There's no certain look or feel to a colorectal cancer survivor. And I think that's been pretty awesome to see.
I'm kind of laughing inside because I remember one of my early years up in DC with Fight CRC. I remember I went to one of the Florida representative's office by myself because another group didn't attend. Yeah. And I was meeting with the staffer and telling them, how colorectal cancer was the only top 5 cancer killer that didn't have dedicated funding at the time. And he goes, why do you think that is? And I said, well, breasts are kind of sexy to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about their shit, And I said, but I've come to learn to love talking shit. And he goes, I love that line.
It is so true. It is so true. I think that's awesome.
So, and this is a question that I am still waiting for somebody to give me an answer that I understand. So I'm not putting the pressure on you, but how do you measure the impact that your advocates have?
So that's fascinating. So I'm getting the numbers checked, Tim. So don't quote me on this, but we are starting to look at this. But I did a little historical digging on this, and I said, how many advocates came on the Hill? How much money was pulled into the DoD budget or into the NCI budget for colorectal cancer? And we were able to look at with every patient, and like I said, we started with like 4 people going to the Hill, then 20 people, then 100, then 200, then 300. And what we saw is this trend of like the more people who advocated, the more people that engaged, the more funding that came in for colorectal cancer. And so I think there are real tangible things that happened, that being one of them. And then I think as we grew and as our voices became stronger and more unified, we saw things like legislation for the colonoscopy loophole bill. We saw passing of coverage for follow-up colonoscopy. And so I think those are the things that make me really proud that we're a squeaky wheel, and it's not necessarily us like writing the check, but it was us empowering people to hold people accountable to write that check. And I think that's how advocacy is working, is when you impact thousands of people by sharing your story, by pushing legislation, and holding our members of Congress accountable.
So is it safe to say, unlike in most for-profit companies where you're expected to hit like your monthly numbers and your quarterly numbers, advocacy is measured in the long game, like we were talking about, in a marathon type of approach, as opposed to like short sprints, right?
Exactly. I think it took us 10 years to get the colonoscopy loophole bill passed. So if someone had said like, oh, you shouldn't do it in year 1 because you didn't move it forward, we wouldn't have had that passed. And so I think you're 100% right. Like, we got to have a vision for what we want to do, and we have to stay really resilient.
And I think, I'm just reminded to, actually, I was in DC many years ago when I was still living in New York, and I was invited to a Atlantic All-State Heartland Monitor poll luncheon, and it was with a bunch of people that were talking about like, how they do good in the world and make an impact. And I'll never forget, I believe it was a guy from Central Kitchen was asking the CEO of Allstate, why don't you just let me measure my impact the way that I want to, instead of the way that you require me to in order to provide funding for us? And I'm wondering, do you ever have that situation come up when you're like working on your advocacy programs with some of the funders that Fight CRC works with, that they're forcing you to like measure things in a way that you're not really saying is the best way that you can utilize these funds to help your advocacy programs?
I think it's an important question. I mean, I think funders have the best of intentions, but it's sort of philosophical to our organization, is like, what is evidence-based, and like, how do we advance the science? And so we published the Colorectal Cancer Care Report for that very reason. We wanted to look at what is the data telling us, and is the data driving, informed action? And so we came up with very specific goals that would help inform our funders, but also our partners and our agency leaders, to say this is the way forward. So we want 80% colorectal cancer screening for all of those who are eligible. And if someone were to choose a non-invasive screening test, they deserve to have a colonoscopy within 90 days. And what we saw is that the data was driving our decision on those numbers, because if you don't get a colonoscopy within 90 days, claims data shows that we lose those patients altogether. They don't ever get the colonoscopy. So if they have a positive non-invasive screening test and they don't get a colonoscopy, it's like they did nothing. So the next piece is that we want patients to have access to treatment within 6 weeks. We want 80% of patients who are eligible to get biomarker testing, and 80% of patients who are eligible to get genetic testing. And I think that those are the things that we believe in. And so we have been very fortunate that our funders see very clearly what our plan is, and they're like on board. So, but we're really, really conservative when it comes to having funders drive our priorities.
Well, thank you for sharing. I know it can be a little sensitive topic because you don't want to upset anybody, but you also want to be
No,
honest. So.
but honestly, Tim, like you got to say no, right? Like you
Yep.
can't just take money and not have sort of the transparency for both the funder and for yourself, like as an organization, to be like, hey, like we're not aligned. Like there is probably another group that's aligned, but maybe not us.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into some fun, quick questions. Just give me the first thing that pops into your head. You don't need to think about these. These are not work related whatsoever. Just kind of fun questions so we get to know you a little bit better, Angie. I'll start with easier ones and then go on to, a little bit deeper ones as we go. But what's your favorite color?
Blue.
I had a feeling that was going to be there. What's your favorite musician or band?
Oh dang. In Deep is like my favorite song this summer. But so A DJ Saved My Life is my favorite song this summer.
Nice. And what's a place that you've always wanted to visit but have never been?
Morocco.
Ooh, nice. I'm going to be close to there later this year, but not in Morocco. So. And finally, as a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
An ambassador. I literally wanted to like be an ambassador. That was all I wanted to do.
I think you're the first person that's ever said that. Well, I got one final question before we just wrap up today is, what is one big thing, if resources were no issue for you, that you would like to do with your advocacy program at Fight CRC?
If resources weren't an issue, I would love to be able to scholarship any survivor who wants to go to Washington, D.C. to share their story. If I could fund that, that's where I think it would be like magical.
I know that would be, and only because I've been there for the last several years and am a mentor for people that are going, and I've seen it grown, and I know it would be probably double in a year if you would just open that up to anybody that wanted to go without having to worry about the funds to be able to get there. So
it's so hard.
I know it is, but if anybody can do it, I know you guys can at Fight CRC. So
we're trying. This has been so fun.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. And how can people learn more about, what Fight CRC does and the advocacy programs that you guys have available?
Gosh, I would love for folks to visit fightcrc.org. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and X. So I would also like to highlight that March is Colorectal Cancer Awareness Month, and that if anybody wants to get involved to raise awareness or go to Washington, D.C., love for people to get engaged.
And I will be there again this March. As long as I'm still here, I will be there. And if anybody's interested or wants more information, they can always reach out to me too, because I will be happy to recruit people to go.
I love it. You're our ultimate ambassador. I love it. But thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you.